The Code of Chivalry in the South by Richard M. Weaver. A part of the Southern heritage which deserves more attention of the serious kind than it has received is expressed by the term chivalry. Modern spite against all assumptions of superiority has assigned it a comic role. Actually, it was an institution of strong and, on the whole, good influence. Since chivalry has been one of the main traditions of European civilization, it was not strange that a chivalric code should develop in the South, which was disposed to accept rather than to reject European institutions. In Europe during the Middle Ages, it had existed as a body of forms and sentiments of enormous power in elevating and refining civilization. It appears to have had its origin in the dark years following the dissolution of Charlemagne's empire, when cruelty, rapine, and brutal anarchy so distressed men that there came a passionate reaction which enlisted men in the service of an ideal good and later found a sanction in the Christian religion. The people recognized a class of knights as representative of right and defenders of order, idealized them, crowned them with all virtues, both real and imaginary, and for 500 years respected them as the ruling caste. Although in its later period chivalry became associated with other things, including the worship of woman, it commenced thus as an order of men of good will, pledged to make might serve right, and although it developed forms, ceremonials, and shows, it was first and foremost a spirit. Of this spirit, the Knights of the Round Table are perfect, if legendary, exemplars, engaged in asserting a rule of justice and humanity against naked strength. Candidates of the order of knighthood were given an initiation which made these duties explicit. An early specimen of the vow required of them was to speak the truth, to succor the helpless, and never to turn back from an enemy. The ethical importance of chivalry lay in the fact that where this spirit made itself felt, there it alleviated, even though it could not entirely overcome, the natural brutishness of man. It furnished a standard by which iniquity could be condemned, however dazzling the success of its perpetrators, and in the darkest times stood as an aspiration and a promise that justice would return and lawful relations obtain among men. In the New World, even more than in Europe, it existed as a spirit, little seen in rituals and ceremonies, but often of surprising influence in determining conduct. It is difficult to say in precisely what company it crossed the Atlantic. That a certain portion of Virginia's first settlers were gentlemen is acknowledged. Captain John Smith's struggles with the indolent colonists, who were 10 times more fit to spoil a commonwealth than either to begin one or but help to maintain one, form a striking episode of early American history, and there can be little doubt that these misplaced men about town would have been happier deciding points of honor than digging stumps. Like some other European institutions, chivalry came over a seedling, but having struck root in the American soil, achieved a lush growth, though modified, sometimes grotesquely, by the rudeness of the American environment. Its recruits were from a well established middle class, and it is probably true that the spirit of chivalry was stronger in the southern states after 200 years of settlement than when the Virginia and Carolina landholders were first clearing their acres. Of the characteristic ideas of chivalry, none came to a more exaggerated flowering in the South than that of personal honor. In the Old World, chivalry supported a caste, the distinguishing mark of which was an honor that was to be preserved at all costs. In the South, as soon as the gentleman caste had established itself on property ownership and slave labor, this concept was invoked to set it apart from the commonality. The gentleman was surrounded with prerogatives. He could not be injured with impunity. His motives could not be impugned. And, above all, his word could not be questioned. A highly touchy sense of personal pride was built on these premises, and its vindication often called for the duel, a recognized institution in America from colonial days. In the Revolutionary period, dueling was fairly common in the North, but it began to disappear there after 1800. In the South, on the contrary, it continued to flourish, and the toll of life exacted by this rigid convention was so great that in 1858, Governor John Lyde Wilson of South Carolina published a pamphlet, The Code of Honor, or Rules for the Government of Principals and Seconds in Dueling. The purpose of this manual was not to encourage the practice, as could be supposed, but rather to diminish it by defining rather narrowly the grounds on which one gentleman might demand satisfaction of another. The author announced it his desire to save lives, which might be lost as a result of challenges made on insufficient grounds. It is easy to see, however, that he retained pride in the institution. Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia, and South Carolina, he observed, would bear away the palm for gentility among the states of the Union, if the prevalence of dueling should be admitted as a criterion. At the same time, Northern criticism of the practice piqued him. He contrasted the urbanity of Southerners with the uncouth civility of the people of Massachusetts, and he intimated that the kind of personal abuse which found its way into Northern journals would, in the South, bring challenges to mortal combat. Elsewhere, opposition to dueling was attributed to the materialistic Puritan skeptics of this country, and anti dueling laws were described as transplanted from the pernicious hotbed of Puritan skepticism. Curious memorials of this once widespread custom survive today. Tennessee requires of all those admitted to the bar an oath that they will not engage in dueling, and governors of Kentucky must swear upon induction into office that they have never fought a duel with a deadly weapon. Another aspect of the Code Duello, which removes further question of its origin in the spirit of chivalry, was the emphasis placed upon the social rank of the combatants. A gentleman might chastise a low fellow with whip or cane for offering him an insult, but he could not, according to the code, meet him on the field of honor, because honor was the exclusive possession of the gentleman caste. Governor Wilson noted in his code that if a man received a challenge from a person with whom he was unacquainted, he might demand a reasonable length of time to ascertain his standing in society, unless he is fully vouched for by his friend. In the days of European chivalry, knights jousted only with knights, and sometimes this privilege was insisted upon even on the field of battle. It is recorded that at Beauvais, a body of Flemish knights refused to charge a force of infantry because they were not gentlemen, and so lost the battle. Because the object of a knight's career was that honor which proceeds from feats of arms, it naturally followed that he was expected to be indifferent toward material rewards, and there seems little doubt that the contempt directed at money getting, as well as the belief that money itself is somehow contaminating, originated with this high and solemn ideal, colored as it was with Christian self denial. Though the attitude was not, of course, carried over unaltered into the American South, there were unmistakable reflections of it. Here the people had come to the New World for the purpose of gathering fortunes, a fact which could not be denied, but which was kept out of sight in various ways. Southern landholders exhibited an aversion to the handling of money, except perhaps at the gaming table. It seemed more in keeping with the haut monde for them to have their business transacted through a factor. To this agent the planter consigned his crop, together with a list of his plantation's requirements, including articles of luxury. The factor sold the produce, forwarded the supplies, and so left his client free from all business duties except a periodical settlement. In this way, many contrived to live as if they had no ties whatever with the world of money economy. Reference was often made to the point that money was a topic of which men of good breeding never mentioned at the table. Such views, combined with the inveterate Southern habit of extravagance, created a type not far removed from the aristocratic wastrels of Europe, incapable of making money by personal effort, but unable to see why it should not be forthcoming to support their elegant mode of life. Like the knight of old, the gentleman was required to speak the truth, and it could be said that the Southern code made a fetish of the pledged word. Falsehood, like an act of cowardice, was supposed to lose one his standing in society, and the convention was enforced with considerable rigor by public opinion. If a gentleman's word was questioned, he demanded an explanation, and then, if the matter could not be adjusted, he proved that honorable status was dearer to him than life by going through the ritual of the duel. Only if he met this supreme test was he judged worthy of the companionship of gentlemen, or, in the language of knighthood, was he deserving of a place in the chivalric order. In antebellum days there was much vague allusion to chivalry, but it remained for the Civil War to provide an interesting commentary on the extent to which this spirit distinguished the Southern people from their Northern adversaries. The difference came out very sharp in the respective attitudes towards war. The Southern people as a whole possessed a highly romanticized picture of the ordeal, which the business-like methods of Grant and Sherman only partly effaced. They regarded it as an elaborate ceremonial to be conducted strictly according to rules and with maximum display, color, and daring. In other words, as a gigantic tournament with the Lord of Hosts for umpire and judge. Some Southerners actually expressed the opinion after First Manassas that the war would promptly cease, because this battle had decided the question of manhood between the two sections, and there was nothing else to be settled. If the people of the North ever subscribed to this notion, they changed it after the removal of the colorful McClellan, and thereafter the task of conquering the South became a business, an official transaction, which cost a great deal more in dollars and men than had been anticipated, but which was at length accomplished by the systematic marshaling of equipment and numbers. John Pope's Virginia campaign gave the South its first intimation that the North was committed to a total war. The Southern people became dismayed by this, for it seemed an infraction of that tacit agreement obtaining among all civilized belligerents. Perhaps it is not too fanciful to read in Lee's terse statement, "Pope must be suppressed," a feeling that he was fighting not so much against a particular enemy as against an outlawed mode of warfare. And when Sherman, Sheridan, and Hunter began their systematic ravaging and punishing of civilians, it seemed to the South that one of the fundamental supports of civilization was being knocked out, and that warfare was being thrown back to the naked savagery from which religion and the spirit of chivalry had painfully raised it in the Middle Ages. The courtly conduct of Lee and his fellow officers to the farm wives of Pennsylvania has perhaps been sentimentalized, but the fact remains that these men felt that they were obeying a code, which is never more needful than in war, when fear and anger are likely to blind men and to destroy their self-control. The material loss in farms and dwellings has been forgotten, nor does the South today appear greatly to resent its economic inferiority, but the memory of how the Great March was conducted lingers on in bitterness. It is not unreasonable to suppose that the Southerner, a prodigal by temperament, has been able to accept the material loss without being able to accept the affront to the tradition by which he was brought up. In any case, the South has persisted in making a distinction among McClellan, Hancock, and Grant, who adhered rather strictly to the code, and such fighting prophets as Sherman, who inaugurated the War of Unlimited Aggression. The former, it was generally held, had fought honestly according to the rules of warfare, eschewing vandalism and terrorism. Naturally, the thought of being beaten came hard to a people priding themselves on their martial traditions, but the memory which rankled in the South for generations was that the enemy, while masking himself under pretensions of moral superiority, had dropped the code of civilization and won in a dishonorable manner. Today, we have gone so far in the direction of nihilism that this attitude seems difficult to credit, but one has only to read the literature of Reconstruction to find it expressed frequently and with conviction. Against Meade, who fatally dashed Southern hopes at Gettysburg, against Grant, who won decisive victories at Vicksburg and at Chattanooga, or against Thomas, who at Nashville gave the Confederacy its most humiliating defeat of the war, one finds little or no complaint. But against Sherman, who admitted that of the $100 million of destruction his armies wrought in Georgia, only 20 million were of military advantage, words could not contain the measure of Southern indignation. Likewise, in New Orleans, resentment against the alleged peculations of Benjamin Butler was as nothing compared with the outrage felt over his famous edict to the ladies, which, according to the Southern code of the time, was beyond the pale. A vehement Southern partisan was to declare after the war that the Southern people pride themselves so on their reputation for chivalry, they were willing to sacrifice everything in preference to it, including the hope of victory. Such feeling characterized the aristocratic class, and in this case, the exceptions would seem to sustain the rule. Those Southern commanders who advocated the other style of warfare, and who, if they had got into the North with independent commands, might have followed policies analogous to those of Sherman and Sheridan, were not members of the gentleman caste, but were hard, self made men who believed simply that war means fighting, and fighting means killing. Of this group were Stonewall Jackson and Nathan Bedford Forrest, both men of the people and both men in whom there ran a streak of ruthlessness. Those who more completely abjured the chivalric rules of warfare won. The military ritual, which had come down from the Middle Ages, was dealt a fatal blow, and the way was cleared for modernism, with its stringency, its abstractionism, and its impatience with sentimental restraints. It scarcely needs pointing out that from the military policies of Sherman and Sheridan, there lies but an easy step to the modern conception of total war, the greatest threat to our civilization since its founding. Even if the Southern feeling of superiority in this matter rested upon facts, supposed rather than real, it would have to be taken into account as one of the points of sectional friction. More than one observer viewed the Civil War as ultimately a clash of character, and the South naturally preferred to see itself clothed in the armor of chivalry. We may note, for example, a significant interview which took place between Captain Fitzgerald Ross of the Austrian Hussars and Judah P. Benjamin, Confederate Secretary of War. Captain Ross mentioned that on his journey to Richmond he had seen many evidences of depredation by the enemy, whereupon the Secretary replied, "If they had behaved differently, if they had come against us observing strict discipline, protecting women and children, respecting private property, and proclaiming as their only object the putting down of armed resistance to the federal government, we should have found it perhaps more difficult to prevail against them. But they could not help showing their cruelty and rapacity. They could not dissemble their true nature, which is the cause of this war. If they had been capable of acting otherwise, they would not have been Yankees, and we should never have quarreled with them." Benjamin was expressing the predominant Southern view. Perhaps the tradition of chivalry led to excesses of its own, but they were not of the grosser sort, and it performed the inestimable service of keeping an ideal of nobility before the people. Few would wish to see the duel restored, or the precious sense of pride which made issues of small misunderstandings. On the other hand, our civilization has suffered no more grievous loss than the disappearance of generosity toward the weak and the vanquished. With the claim to exclusive right by an individual or a nation expressing itself in the arrogant formula of unconditional surrender, the spiritual community of men dissolves, and we are at the threshold where everything is swallowed up in power. The pattern of chivalry, however, had other effects on Southern culture which must be pointed out. It definitely tended to discourage art and letters. The barrier which it raised against persons from lower social levels was less serious than that which it set up against the scholar and the creative thinker, and even the Southern conception of education was influenced by its ideals. Knights are performers of the jest. Only rarely are they singers of them. The poets and troubadours of Europe, who made them live in story, had an uncertain position. They enjoyed some license, and they were valued for their special contributions. But the attitude of society toward them was one of tolerance rather than serious respect. And in that transplanted chivalry which grew up on American shores, one finds a comparable attitude, even somewhat accentuated by the rawness and Philistinism of a new country. For although it is true that only a fraction of the populace belonged to that class, all aspiration was in its direction. There were no centers of commercial or intellectual activity in which competing ideals could emerge, and no other pattern was consciously followed. The situation of Southern men of letters points to the broader truth that in every aristocracy the artist tends to be déclassé. He has often been patronized and supported by the aristocrats, but the patronage and support have only symbolized the gulf between him, a supernumerary, a hireling, and those who have laid title to estates by deeds or by inheritance. This truth is not weakened by the fact that members of the aristocracy have themselves dabbled in art and letters. In instances, they have done so to the extent of winning more illustrious names by these than by their rank. But it will be found virtually without exception that they have regarded such employments as elegant exercises, to be pursued for diversion, or to be exhibited as evidence of versatility. The notion of following letters as a profession was quite as foreign to the Southern gentleman as it was to the English nobleman, and his position was, if anything, less favorable for it. His career was that of a man of the world. His education was devised to meet its demands, and if he developed some special skill at authorship, that was a matter for congratulation, but seldom was there a suggestion that he capitalize it by making it his means of support or his claim to recognition by society. This aristocratic prejudice, which had its foundation in the institution of chivalry, determined the content of Southern education and made inevitable the slightness and sterility of the Southern contribution to belles lettres.